This album, 1985, this new album. It's what's the story behind the release of this record?
Well, Talas is a band I've been involved with since the early 70s,
Uh-huh.
gone through many incarnations. The final incarnation of it back in uh, the mid 80s
Mhm.
uh, was really a riot to play with. And we got very close to getting what we were going for. And then I got an offer to go somewhere else, and I did. And we got together recently to do a little reunion for that band, that lineup, and we had so much fun. We thought, why not get in a little time machine and go back to 1985 and record all those songs we performed live, which we had hoped to someday make a record out of, and finally complete that goal and get in that time machine, go back there and do it the way we used to do it, and that's how it went down.
All right. So is this are these reworkings of old recordings, or were they just sketched out in all these years ago?
The songs that we performed live, and that's a good thing, I think, for me personally, and not other musicians I know that say the same thing. When you put out a record, uh, then you go on tour. At the end of the tour, you want to re-record the record because playing it live is the best thing to do for a song. As you groove into it, and you start coming up with better ideas, and uh, it falls together better. And a lot of bands have what's called a sophomore jinx, I think you've heard of,
Yeah.
in that their first record is a culmination of years and years of playing and writing and recording and performing. And their first record does great. And then they have 4 months to make another one. So there's not that much time. So having played this stuff for years back in the day, and then coming up to present time and performing it in the reunion shows that we did, kind of reignited our memories of it and what we used to do. Uh, Made it really gave it a special, I don't know, uh, cohesiveness
Yeah.
and a feel to it that when we went back to record this stuff, everything we used to do back in the day kind of came back to us easily, even though it had been over 30 years since
Yeah.
we had done anything.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about going back in 1985, and I think you referred to a time machine, and of course you have the DeLorean on the front cover. So the Back to the Future reference is also from 1985. I presume that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, that was the genius of Hugh Syme, the cover artist. He's quite a legendary guy, and we had a little conversation. I told him what what we were doing. He was friends with our singer Phil as well,
Yeah.
and so we were supremely grateful for the amazing job he did for us. But we kind of told him the idea that rather than slick up everything and modernize it and make it all up to date, let's go back in time and play it like we used to play it, very in the same way we did it back then. And so I think he picked up the cue from that. And the DeLorean was his idea. That was brilliant. And he's just a wonderful guy, and just did a great job on the cover.
But yeah, it's done a great job. I think it's great artwork. I remember I showed it to my children the other night, and we're all big fans of Back to the Future here. So it certainly struck a chord with us. But so you've reworked or recorded these songs that you were thrashing out live all those years ago. Why did you feel the need to record a new Black and Blues, a new one, isn't it?
Yeah, we were performing. We did a bunch of reunion shows. We did a week in New York City. We did Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, some of the cities we used to play in a lot.
Yeah.
And so to do a whole set, which is about one hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, uh, we included a few new songs, and one of them was Black and Blue. That was one of Phil's songs. So no, there's no real plan to it. We just liked the song, and we thought let's do it on the record. One cool thing about the song is Phil had his son James come and sing harmony with him, and Phil was just exploding with pride for his son. How he did a great job, and his son is quite a good singer in his own right. And he sang harmony and a few other tracks on the record, Crystal Clear and a few others. So having that song on the record was a good opportunity for Phil and his son to sing together on a more modern song. And we liked the song. We were performing it live, and we said, let's throw it on there.
Yeah. Also perhaps a wonderful tribute to Phil. I think. I mean, he passes away just after this album. Was recording this album difficult for him? And did you know while you were recording this album you were going to lose him?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was in my home studio in Nashville, and we were using it as a talkback to the studio in Toronto where Phil was recording the vocals. And so I'd have him and the engineer and myself on the screen like you and I are now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another computer in my studio that ran my audio. And there's a special software where I could listen in real time to the recording console. Magical piece of software. I don't know how they do it. So I was there with the lyric sheet, and we were producing the vocals. And I knew Phil. We knew he'd gone into remission, and but I noticed while we were working, sometimes he'd get a little forgetful, like something was on his mind, like he'd sing a lyric, the wrong lyric, and say, "No, Phil, go back," and he'd sing it wrong again, and go, "Phil, cross it out and write the new lyric in, so you don't make it." That happens a lot with all vocalists. So, yeah. So I didn't put too much attention on it, but it did catch my thought. So later on, I found out that Phil knew at that time that it was not looking good, and so finding that out later added to my respect and admiration that I had for Phil, knowing that he got up to that microphone and gave every ounce, every molecule he could, and kicked it so hard and knocked it out of the park. He did so great, but he knew that it wasn't going to go so well. We didn't quite until after it was done, and then he ended up being hospitalized. But I already had huge respect for Phil as a person and as a singer, but this put it so over the top to know that he knew he was in trouble, but he kept going anyway, and he kept pushing like nothing was wrong. And when you listen to the vocal, in my humble opinion, he just did such a great job. Just the personality and tonality and his pitches and his articulation was just fantastic. So we were extremely honored to work with him. And we look back at this. Initially, the album was put out, the title 1985, and all to pay tribute to a time in music. 1985 was amazing. I had moved to LA right after Talas, and Sunset Boulevard sidewalks were 6 people deep with people in a rock and roll, and it was like Mardi Gras every night, and there were bands and clubs everywhere, and it was an amazing scene. So we meant for the record to be a tribute to that in many ways, but it now also is a tribute to the legacy of a truly great man, a truly wonderful guy, and a supreme talent. So that's the way we will hopefully cement Phil's legacy as to how awesome he was. With certainly, we hope to do some degree of that with this record.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned using the technology to record this album. Would you describe this as a lockdown album? Because I think the first McCartney album was a lockdown album as well. There's quite a few of them. There's a whole subgenre now. Was this a lockdown album? Would you say?
Certainly was. Yeah. I was on tour in Europe when the pandemic began, and we didn't know whether or not we should continue going or stop. And I said, and we were just on our way to a show in Russia, I believe.
Russia, blimey.
And I remember saying to the guys, if we can't get back in the country because they decided to shut down the borders, they're not going to put us up in a Four Seasons hotel. We'll be lucky to be in a tent or an army barracks at best. So we said, well, we gotta pull out. So we went back home, and I started working a lot in my home studio. So that was good because my studio chops were in good shape. So by the time we did this record, I was up for it very well. We went to our drummer's house, Mark Miller. It was his birthday yesterday, incidentally. Uh,
Okay.
and in the house that Mark built from the ground up, he's a brilliant craftsman, architect, and builder, an unbelievable talent
Yeah.
in so many fields. On the kit that he built, we got in a room together and laid down basic tracks for the record. So then Phil was going to come down to Nashville initially, but the border crossing between the US and Canada was getting really difficult. So he stayed there. It turned out to be a little bit of a blessing in disguise because the engineer we used in Toronto, Russ McKay, ended up mixing the record and did an amazing job on it. So he used to come see the band play back in the day. So he knew exactly what to do mix wise to make it sound the way it did. We're very, very pleased with what he did for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great sounding record as well. I mean, it's been described as a musical snapshot of the 1980s.
Wow.
In your opinion, what defines that 80s sound? What does that mean exactly?
Well, I think there was an urgency
Yeah.
to it and not huge attention to detail because with that urgency comes I remember doing records where, hey, hurry up, we got 2 days, let's go.
Yeah.
And that's not the best way to make every record, but sometimes it is a really good way. I remember I had an incredible moment where Mr. Big was playing in Japan, and Robert Fripp happened to be there and showed up, and
Wow.
we hung out backstage, and afterwards we went out to the hotel bar and had drinks. And he told me the story of the first King Crimson record
Wow.
and the Crimson King, how they did that in somebody's living room in about a week.
That's
And I thought, there's one of the most iconic, arguably
absolutely.
one of the records that began the whole progressive rock movement. In my mind, it is.
Yeah.
And they did it in a week in somebody's living room. So
Yeah.
this was done in Mark's living room. So that's not quite a King
Making
Crimson record.
parallels.
I know that. But I think that 80s thing there's an urgency to the records. You got to get in and do it. And therefore, you had to have played that stuff live and know it and got it down, or you're quick enough mentally and with your musical facility that you can get it down. Another record I did I think it was in 1985 as well. By the time I got to LA, was the first Tony McAlpine record.
Okay.
We were in a studio where the recording part was in one building. There was another building where people would hang out.
Mhm.
And I'd be in the room recording, play my bass parts. Tony would be working out his parts for the next song. We'd pass each other literally in the parking lot. Then I'd go learn the next song and he'd record. We'd pass each other again. We got that whole record done in less than 3 days.
Wow. Wow.
That's one of my favorite records I've ever played on as well. The Edge of Insanity record.
Yeah. I mean, there's a track on there called "Close to the Killer." I'm interested in what's the story behind that one?
Well, it's about kind of like an MMA fighter or a boxer and somebody who's in his proximity and what it's like to be around that thing where you're with someone that could at any given moment would
Yeah.
probably knock you out permanently, and the kind of what surrounds a person like that. And I've always, for my songwriting, I've always kind of taken a little bit of a left turn on what the song is about. I made it a rule that I wouldn't use the word heart, love, or baby in any of my songs, just so it force me. Now I have since used it once or twice,
Right.
right? But it would force me to come up with an idea and a story that was different than what was going on. And I was always intrigued by songs that had an unusual point of view. A lot of early Genesis songs about "Get 'Em Out by Friday" or
Yeah.
the song about the giant hogweed.
That's Return of the Giant Hogweed.
Yeah, unbelievable, brilliant, and
Absolutely.
it's brilliant too. The hogweed song is basically the story of communism infiltrating the West. Is
Okay.
quite amazing. So that always intrigued me. I don't know if I could ever come up with something that spectacular, but I'm giving it a shot to just to try to force myself to do something a little different and dig deep when it comes to concepts and lyrics and rhymes and rhyming schemes about a boxer or MMA fighter and those around him.
Sure. I mean, you interesting. We talk about progressive rock. I've heard you talk in other interviews about how the audience is very important to the performance and the music. But a lot of these progressive rock bands, I mean, take a band like Pink Floyd, you watch them play, they seem to be totally oblivious to the audience being there. The
Yeah, it's
audience might
funny.
not be. I mean, they did that Pompeii show, where they just played to nobody. It seems it seems an odd sort of genre like that, I think.
Yeah, well, where we all grew up, all the Talas guys, I remember in the early days, we'd play in a club and the stage would be about this high
Yeah.
and there was no dressing room. So we'd step off the front of the stage and sit down at whatever table our friends were at and talk and look up at the clock. Oh, time for another set. Walk up on stage and go. So there was no separation between the crowd and the band. And looking back on that, it was a blessing in disguise because we were together with it. We knew what hey, we got to put a new song in the set list. What do you think? It's okay. So we go back and either drop it or change it.
Yeah.
We had our thumb on the pulse of the audience and we were woven right in there with them. I prefer that. I think that's a better thing. That's for me. Everybody's different. I do like the fact that there is what's happening on stage isn't what's happening in the audience. There is a thing, but when the show's over or when the set's over, that comes down.
Yeah.
And I'm always out at all the tours I do. Like a lot of times now, they have a paid meet and greet, which I don't like at all. But you gotta pay the bills. And so sometimes people write to me and say, I'd like to come to the meet and greet, but I don't have the money. I already paid for the tickets. So just meet me outside by the bus. We'll take photos. We'll sign things. So almost all the time after any show, people know I'm going to be out there hanging out, and we'll take photos and I'll sign whatever you want for free, of course. And
Yeah.
but it's a good thing because being that close to people that come to the show, you hear what they have to say and what they think and what they dig. And as a side benefit, I got amazing friends all over the world that I value greatly.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting song called "I'll Take the Night," which seems to be a number about the early days of the band. Do you look back fondly upon those times? I think you probably already touched upon this in your previous answers.
Yeah, well, I do, but I do have to stress also it was a tough time. It was high stress. We didn't know what was going to happen. The band, prior to me leaving, we did get a record deal. A guy named Danny Goldberg signed the band to Gold Mountain Records. He later went on to manage Nirvana. He's still quite a big executive in the music biz. So, but even if we would have done a record, who knows what would have happened? There's no guarantees of anything. I've seen great bands put out amazing records that went nowhere. So it was a little bit precarious. But that was also the fire that was lit under us because we got on stage every night and we got to do the best show we ever did in our life tonight. Yeah, there's only 40 people here. Well, let's do it anyway. It was a tough time and a lot of pressure and a lot of worry. But I think that honed down the edge very well for my later years. And I look back at all the experiences I had from back then, and they served me very well as I was very fortunate to have a career extend out from there.
Sure. With this new Talas album, can we assume that have we seen the end of the Winery Dogs?
Oh, we just finished a new Winery Dogs record.
All right. Okay.
And
You're juggling two balls at the same time.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a common thing now. I remember when there was a time you got in one band, you stayed in that band till you retired. It's just not the case anymore. With everybody I know, I was playing in several things. But yeah, Winery Dogs, I love that band. Mike Portnoy and Richie Kotzen, respectively, on drums and guitar. We just finished a new record. It's mixed and mastered. The cover art is done. The
Yeah.
credits are in. They're booking the tour right now for next year, and they're booking all over the place. So we're very, very excited about that. And
Mhm.
there's a couple other bands also that I'm involved in. I don't have any news about Sons of Apollo. That's a band I was in when the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'll do more with that soon. Niacin is another band I have. It's just bass drums and B3, no vocals,
Right.
with Dennis Chambers on drums. We may do something with that soon too. So there's a couple of other things we have, because one band isn't always just a complete full-time thing anymore. And I remember when it first happened, just in like the late '80s in LA, some guys from bands were going out and doing other things with other entities, and I that 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 was the start of it. And then it's very common now, I believe, for people to play in several different things. Plus, as a player, I like to stretch out, and when you're playing with other people, especially drummers, it just you expand your vocabulary on what you can do and how you approach a piece and your feel. And between Dennis Chambers and Mike Portnoy and Ray Lugier from Korn, I do a lot of work with him too. Greg Bissonette, a lot of drummers that I love very much. That has really helped me to become, I think, a better player and understand more about my ultimate role, which is bass and drums.
Sure. I mean, you talk about bass and drums. Who's your, if you look back through the history of rock music, who's your favorite combination of bass and drums in any band?
I might say Mel Shecker and Don Brewer from Grand Funk.
Grand Funk Railroad, fantastic band.
Pretty great rhythm section. And
Wow.
I remember I was doing a sound check with Dennis Chambers, as one of the foremost jazz funk fusion
Yeah.
guys in the world. And I started playing "Nothing Is the Same" by Grand Funk off the closer to home, and he knew it. I thought, Dennis, it's so great to see somebody that's that high up look at the Grand Funk as quite a great. I love that band. We
Yeah.
must have played, 6 or 7, almost the whole closer to home record we
Right.
did when we were a copy band. Pretty
Well,
cool.
I'm doing an interview with Mark Farner very
Great.
soon. I think I'm absolutely psyched about it. So I love Grand Funk Railroad.
Yeah, I
Uh,
did a rock and roll fantasy camp, and he was there. I got up and played with him. I think
yeah.
we did the locomotion and something else we did, but that was a bucket list I had, playing with Mark Farney. Wonderful guy too. What a voice! He sings as good as ever.
I know he does it. You look at some of those live performances recently. I don't know how he does it. He sounds fantastic.
Amazing. So great.
But talk about drum and bass combinations. Are you a fan of John Entwistle and Keith Moon together?
I'm sorry. One more time.
Talk about drum and bass combinations. Are you a fan of like Keith Moon and John Entwistle sort of way?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic between different ones.
Yeah,
John was a busy player,
yeah,
and Keith was a maniac, but Pete was just playing those chords. So
yeah.
it worked together perfectly. John moved the bass notes around to make the guitar's chords sound different harmonically, while Keith just did his thing. It's beautiful. Jack Bruce and
Oh
Ginger
God,
Baker,
yes,
brilliant,
absolutely,
amazing.
absolutely.
A huge Billy Cobham fan,
Right.
and just quite awesome. But I've been lucky to play with really good drummers, great drummers, and they've all left their mark on me. I think because I really, when I go see a band, the first guy I watch is a drummer. If that's happening, we're okay. And
Okay.
the first thing I learned about bass before I even had one, I went over this band that used to rehearse near my house, and the bass player Joe was a dear friend of mine, and I wanted to be like him. That's why I became a bass player, because Joe was a cool guy. And they wouldn't let me come in to watch them rehearse because I was just a little kid. My older brother and sisters could, but I was a little kid. So I'd sit out in the driveway and listen through the basement window, or I'd lay in my bed at night and hear him off in the distance. So one day they let me in, and it was just Joe, the bass player, and his drummer. I said, Joe, where's the rest of the band? Why aren't you, how can you play without them? He goes, no, you see, every time the drummer hits his bass drum, I got to play a bass note. And that's how, and before I even owned a bass, I learned thankfully, learned the most fundamental requirement ever, that when a drum hits, a bass note plays, and you got to
Yeah.
lock in like that. So that was a huge jump in my understanding of bass as I say, prior to even owning one.
Yeah. Of course, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. I mean, those
Oh
guys are
yeah.
incredible as well. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, Mitch Mitchell's playing he was really a really
Yeah.
jazzy
Well,
player.
as was Ginger Baker from Cream.
Yeah, very, very much. And just it's interesting the combinations between. That's a good question. I should do a little study on that between all the different bass players and drummers and how they work because it's to me it's quite fascinating.
Absolutely. I'm interested. How did David Lee Roth come to record Shy Boy?
Well, I had the last tour I did with Talas was Talas and Ingve,
Hmm.
and we started in L.A. and worked our way across the country in summer of '85, hence the album name. And we went to we started in L.A.
Yeah.
But I had received a phone call a few weeks earlier from David Lee Roth's office saying that he wanted to speak with me about being in a movie. What? So I got to LA and they drove me out to Dave's house and I had a meeting with him, walking in his backyard. He goes, "Well, there is a movie, but that's not why I got in touch with you." I go, "Well, what's going on?" He goes, "You got to be sworn to secrecy, but I just quit Van Halen." Wow, I was shocked. And then he goes, "Let's start a band. Let's find a guitarist and a drummer and we'll go." And I said, "I'm in." So the next night we played at the Palladium with Ingve and Dave was there. A couple of rumors started floating around, but they didn't catch fire yet. And then he came out to see us also. We played in New York City for one of the last shows we did. And he saw us perform Shy Boy in each instance. And it was his idea. He liked the song. Let's put it on the record. So I'm supremely and forever grateful for that.
Yeah. It's interesting. Around about that time, when Van Halen were all splitting up, Gene Simmons tells a story how Eddie Van Halen was interested in joining Kiss. I don't know how serious the conversation was, but of course they went with Vinnie Vincent after a while. But I'm not sure if that would have worked or not. But
Yeah.
talking of Gene Simmons, actually, he says rock is dead. Do you agree with him?
Uh, I don't think any form of music ever really goes away,
Yeah.
especially now, because I see guys doing rockabilly and guys doing, stoner rock, Grateful Dead style,
Oh
uh,
wow.
all these different Southern rock, uh, all these different genres and subgenres of rock are all alive and very, very well. And you go to the festivals in Europe, and man, there's 100,000 people there. And in South America, it's crazy. We would play in front of sold out, huge crowds all the time.
Yeah.
And I think in the mainstream, from what you can see by turning on your regular television or regular radio, if you even do that, um, that rock is pretty much not there. But when you walk out in the street
Yeah.
and rock is really alive, it's tough for new bands. I will give into that. Sadly, I'd like to see better the gates open wider and the road paved a little smoother for new bands and new music because we need that lifeblood. But there are a few escaping through and coming up.
Well,
If it
that's the
was,
point. That's the point Gene Simmons makes. I think that uh, new bands aren't invested in now. The way Pink Floyd, the way the Beatles, the way the Stones, the Kinks were invested in. And he says we're not going to see another Beatles, Stones, or Kinks anymore. I think that's what he means by it's dying, really.
yeah, I think it's going to be tough to see. The Beatles were a phenomenon, but
Absolutely.
part of that phenomenon was their timing. The
Yeah.
baby boomers were all right at that age where they all wanted to hear, "I want to hold your hand, please please me and love me do." Then as they got a little older, it was the White Album and Let It Be, and the Beatles paralleled the growth from pre-teens and teens to 20-year-olds uh, with their music, and it's almost like a soundtrack of the largest population bubble we've had in a long time. So to do that again, there's too many factors that can't be in place, unfortunately. But there have been many phenomena that have come out. When Van Halen came out, they got huge. There's a bunch of young bands that are I don't know how to pronounce their name, but Maneskin, the
Uh,
girl.
I'm not sure either, but I've heard of them. They're
Yeah,
very good.
yeah. I think they have a real spirit about them. I haven't listened to them much musically. A little bit sounds good, but one thing I do notice is they have a real spirit. Remember when Hendrix came out? That
Yeah.
was my first concert, and it changed. That changed the world. Now the
Yeah.
Beatles were already well established and moving on, but uh, yeah, there'll always be some new thing. It may not have the impact of the Beatles, but it will have impact. And I do believe that this form of music is here for for as long as people will be on Earth.
Well, a friend of mine, he in the '60s, bands used to have residencies at the Marquee and places like that. And he was a huge Who fan. And he's one of his first gigs was the Who, supported by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which must
Wow.
have been about '67 or something like that. I would have thought the Who were
Well,
quite a live act back in the day as well. I
well, we
mean,
used to do in some of the clubs. We used to do a week long. We'd get there on a, I think on a, we'd start Tuesday and work through to Sunday. Then move to another club and do the same thing. For a while in Buffalo, it was like that. So we'd be at the same place, the same gear set up every night. And again, there was an advantage to that because there were no variables. You
yeah,
could spend a whole week doing it where you could hear your voice and it was all set up right. And again, so many of those little things really later on paid off in that kind of experience and understanding.
sure. I mean, I know you're a huge Beatles fan, but I'm interested to ask you, which of these debut albums do you think is the most important in terms of the history of music? Frank Zappa's and the Mothers' first album, the Doors' debut album, or the Elvis debut album?
Well, I
That's a tough
could
question.
probably recite Freak Out
Oh,
from
wow.
beginning
Yeah.
to end. I knew that record so well on so many levels, musically, lyrically, philosophically. And it was a very important record for me philosophically because it was Frank Zappa. I really loved his point of view and the way he
Yeah,
looked at the world and
absolutely.
his observations. So I'd have to go with that because
It's an album that influenced the Beatles as well, because Paul McCartney has said that he was listening to that album when he was thinking of the concept for Sergeant Pepper.
brilliant.
So I think it's a hugely influential album.
Yeah,
Um,
it's kind of obscure with some people because it's not accessible to the average listener. If you're looking
no,
for one song after another, it wasn't really that. And but I love that format that there's things in between the songs and there's talking and there's this. It was a real great example of a record being cinematic,
yeah,
being like
absolutely.
a movie. It had its car chases and even as romantic. Uh, how could I be such a fool? That song at the oh my, what a brilliant, beautiful,
See,
incredible song. I
see,
want to read.
I find the first Zappa album to be more accessible than the one that follows it. I think Absolutely Free is harder work to listen to. But it's
Exactly.
interesting. I think if I'm not mistaken, that obviously it was a double album, but I think in the UK it was just a single album. It
Really?
was, yeah, I think so. Which
Yeah.
I don't know what they cut off it.
Wow. Yeah. And then we're only in it for the money was another one that I could probably. Well, those first three or four records, I when Steve Vai and I get together, and if I have a glass of wine, we'll
Yeah,
end up singing the whole record. It's
yeah,
pretty funny.
yeah. Um, Alive or Dead? Who is the greatest bass player in your opinion?
Um, Unknown Niels Henning Orsted Pedersen. He's a jazz classical bass player from Denmark. Other than that, I would probably go with I'd have to say all metrics being equal, it would have to be Paul McCartney.
Wow, yeah, he's a
Now,
fabulous bass
I
player.
love Tim Bogert, Paul Samuel Smith from the Yardbirds.
Yeah,
They were my two guys when I started. Then later on, Jocko and Stanley and Jack Bruce, all of that. But McCartney was a part of the Beatles, which okay, extra points for that. But if you remove that and just listen to his playing, he was so melodically, beautifully all over the neck
Yeah.
you know, moving, weaving in and out. He was a very busy player,
Yeah.
but it worked because I believe, because he was a singer. A lot of times, vocalists make good bass players.
Yeah.
But I just think that his impact on music in general, aside from his bass playing, was huge. But I do think his bass playing was. I would have to give it to him. It's tough because there's guys that can play circles around him, of course.
Yeah.
There's guys that can play circles around anybody,
Yeah.
uh, but and that isn't always the criteria. I think the fact that he did what he did, a little help from my friends, the bass solos and tones, and the way it wove in and out with the chords and harmonies is just compositionally absolutely brilliant. A close second would be James Jamerson, who did the same thing with Motown.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think Paul had a broader sweep. Kind of unfair, again, because he was in the Beatles. If the Beatles weren't very famous, I don't know if he might have got that. But I have to say that I think he was a huge contributing factor as to why they were so famous and did so well, were so successful. I believe he was
Um, I can't remember
contribution.
who was the name of the bass player that used to play with Booker T and the MGs.
Oh, uh,
Was that Donald Duck Dunn? Was he the bass player, or somebody used to call him
I think
Mouse?
it was. Yeah, I remember him because he never changed the strings on his bass.
Right.
They were the
Right.
same. I think the strings were on it when he bought it, or on it when he stopped playing. Pretty amazing.
Incredible. I've just got one more question really for you, and that is, are we going to see any kind of Talas live dates, or do you think you'll do anything, or get something together live, or?
Well, since we lost Phil, we've thought about it. Uh, if only just to have a night of uh, in honor of Phil and
Yeah.
what he did and how great he sang in this. A couple singers from some other bands have contacted us and would like to do that, so we may do that and see how it goes. But I would love to perform this music, especially Mark Miller as a drummer. We
Yeah.
spoke before about bass drums. He's a riot to play with, and our guitarist Kiri, who played on this record, did a fantastic job. So, yeah, I would love to play these songs again live, and I think it's going to be big shoes to fill for somebody on a as far as Phil Narrow's vocals go. But you know, we'll see what we can do. I would love to. So we're keeping that door open.
Sure. I hope so. Anyway, Billy, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I wish you the best of luck with this album. I hope it sells beyond expectations, even if in honor of Phil, I think. But I'll let you go and have your breakfast because it's quite early where you are, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just about 9:30, so I'll
Okay,
be
I'll let
okay.
you go and have your breakfast and
Barry,
enjoy the
thank you
rest of
so
your
much
day.
for having me. Thank you for having me, and appreciate all your kind words.
My pleasure. You enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care. See ya.
Bye.
Bye bye.